Good evening, everybody, and the warmest welcome after this glorious Sunday and weekend. And we've got a very special treat tonight. We have a talk, as you know, by N.T. Wright, professor and great authority on St. Paul and much else besides. And the title of the talk is Who Was St. Paul? My apologies for the lateness in beginning tonight. For the first time, for some inexplicable reason, my computer wasn't working, so I am talking to you with voice only over the telephone. That matters even less than it normally would, because we have a glorious 45-minute talk coming up. Can you please send your questions in the normal way, and they will then be messaged to me, and I will then be able to ask them on your behalf. Can I encourage you to ask questions? And we love to have them, and I will get in as many as possible. Brief questions are good, and do put your name if you want to. So I'm looking forward to this talk very much. I've spent much of my life wondering who was St. Paul, and I've got a feeling that in 45 minutes time that wondering will cease and I will have the answers. So Tom, thank you very, very much for coming to this University of Buckingham Fireside Great Minds series. It's a great honor and pleasure to have you.
Thank you very much, and I'm delighted to be with you, and sorry about your computer. I do sometimes wonder what St. Paul himself would have made of our communications technology when all he had to do was to dictate a letter and then send somebody off and wait to see what happened. I'm not sure that ours is necessarily any better than that. Anyway, if you mention St. Paul in polite company, especially in Britain, you will almost certainly get a negative reaction. When I became chaplain of an Oxford college in the mid-80s, the senior fellow asked me about my original doctorate. And when I said it was on St. Paul, he muttered, "A very wicked man, a very wicked man." And that's a common perception. A clerical friend of mine told me recently that his tutor at theological college, who was supposed to be teaching him the Bible, complained that Paul was, quote, "such a difficult little man," with the suggestion that one shouldn't try too hard to understand him, it would only make trouble. And this impression is reinforced by those who, at the opposite end of the spectrum, claim Paul as their great hero. Lutherans and Calvinists have made him their patron saint, and their interpretations of him have sometimes, alas, seemed to be responsible for putting people off not only the apostle himself, but the whole Christian message, despite the fact that there are many in those traditions whose interpretations of Paul have been powerful and attractive. My own Anglican tradition often hasn't known what to do with Paul. I once interviewed a seasoned parish priest who confessed that he'd managed to avoid studying Paul entirely at college, and that in 10 or 15 years of ministry, he'd never preached on the epistles. To his credit, he had come to me to ask for some remedial reading. I remain an enthusiast for St. Paul, and in my various books, I've tried to explain why. I have found Paul and his writings personally and intellectually stimulating throughout my life. In fact, Paul's shortest letter, the little one to Philemon, was the first book of the Bible I ever read through when I was not quite 5 years old and had just been given my first Bible. And in my teens, I chose at school to write a special essay on Paul's journeys, partly because I've always liked maps and figuring out how to get from A to B, but equally because by then my own faith and Christian experience had developed to the point where some of Paul, at least, was coming alive for me, and I was eager to find out more. Then, when I was an undergraduate, one of the groups that I hung out with, alongside the rugby club and various musical societies, was a group of Christians who put Bible study, not least the study of Paul, front and centre. As I look back now, I would say that the questions we brought to Paul were often slanted and immature, but that's fine. That's what a university is all about. You have to start somewhere, whatever the subject, and bumping your nose repeatedly against the actual texts forces you to think things through in new ways. So I got well and truly hooked. And yes, I ended up doing my doctorate on Paul's greatest letter, the long one to the Romans. And that for me was where the story really began, because the more I read Romans, the more convinced I became, for literary and artistic reasons as well as theological, that that great letter as a whole was a much tighter and more intricate argument than the standard interpretations in most churches had allowed. And I increasingly came to think that the way Romans was normally read, privileging the first 8 chapters or even the first 4, and mostly ignoring the last 8 chapters, was about as sensible as announcing on the radio that you were going to be listening to Mozart's Jupiter Symphony and then only playing the first 2 movements. Romans is in fact a symphony in 4 movements. As you may detect, my second love throughout my life has been music. Anyway, that sense that Paul has been shortchanged and that we haven't really grasped who he was and what he was all about opened up for me in new ways when I then dived deep into the first century Jewish world, which was Paul's natural habitat. In particular, I remember working through the Dead Sea Scrolls and the great historian Josephus and other writings of that period, and realizing with a shock that, unlike many modern Christians, the first century Jews were not sitting around discussing what you had to do to be sure of going to heaven when you died, which was what you might have imagined from the Christian traditions that Paul might well have been interested in. No, first century Jews were not actually that interested in us going to heaven. They left that to the Platonic philosophers, though some Jews, like Philo of Alexandria, did indeed look to Plato to help them interpret their great biblical traditions. No, Jews like Saul of Tarsus, who became Paul the Apostle, believed indeed that God would look after them after their death, but their concern was not how they would get to heaven, but how the life of heaven, the very presence of Israel's God himself, would come and dwell on the earth at last. Much more, in fact, like what Jesus said when he taught his followers to pray, "Thy kingdom come on earth as in heaven." That's the emphasis. God would come, they believed, and would fill not only the Jerusalem temple, but the whole of creation with glory and justice and healing power. But if you try to make Paul answer different questions to those, you will misunderstand him. I'm reminded of that wonderful musical moment in the movie Amadeus, when the emperor is listening to Mozart and gets a bit flustered, and he declares that there are too many notes. And would the young man kindly take some of those notes out to make it easier on the listener? Well, that is what many readings of Paul have done, both in the church and in the academy, to say nothing of popular level perceptions. We have wanted a more simplistic Paul, but such belittling misses the point and condemns itself to shallow and unsatisfactory readings. So what are we to do? As a way in, I want to propose to you tonight that we consider St. Paul in a category you might not suspect. The more I contemplate his writings as a whole and in their detail, the more I am compelled to use for him a word that we reserve for a very select group. St. Paul, I suggest to you, was a genius. The word genius is tossed around lightly these days, but there are still some people for whom no other word will do. One of the great dictionaries, Merriam-Webster, speaks of genius being somebody with extraordinary native intellectual power, and of a person being endowed with transcendent mental superiority, inventiveness, and ability. We think of somebody who acquired an early mastery of one or more fields of skill or study, and who then took off vertically to produce results which we can confidently say nobody else would even have thought of, let alone accomplished. Now, let's take some examples and then apply them to St. Paul, because when it comes to geniuses, we all have our favourites. My first one you will have already guessed, Mozart, of course. But I will also include 2 from very different worlds, Gerard Manley Hopkins, the poet, and Albert Schweitzer. And I'm proposing that if you have that kind of a list, St. Paul should be on it as well. Let's line them up and see how they illuminate the great apostle. Mozart played piano and violin to concert standard from a young age. As with mathematics and chess, music can sometimes be mastered young. But with that under his belt, the young Wolfgang developed at speed. He innovated. He broke out of regular forms. He experimented this way and that. Despite considerable personal suffering and difficulty, he showered his world with a glory which still sparkles brightly centuries later. Now, think about it. Something else that can be mastered young is the complex world of Jewish scripture and tradition. And all we know of St. Paul suggests that that's how he began. He had an easy fluency with the scriptures, both in Hebrew and in Greek, and a passionate dedication to what he called the traditions of the fathers, that is, the burgeoning world of Jewish interpretation and application of those scriptures. Paul knew the great stories. He prayed the Psalms. He kept the law. All this made him then what we might call a political activist, determined to bring the wider Jewish world into line with God's will, looking ahead to the day when the Messiah would come to rescue them and make all things new. But then in a rush, starting with that famous moment on the road to Damascus, Paul had a new direction, a new coherence, a new passion, resulting in an astonishing life's work. He too innovated, he experimented, he agonized, he wept, and he brought to birth a new world of thought, of spirituality, of prayer, of personal devotion. If we think of the great moments in his writing, think, for instance, of the famous final paragraph of Romans chapter 8, concluding that nothing in all creation can separate us from the love of God in the anointed Jesus. When you read a paragraph like that, it feels like the prestissimo coda at the end of a Mozart sonata or symphony. It's glorious. So Mozart for starters. But now consider a very, very different character. The Roman Catholic poetic genius Gerard Manley Hopkins. And he stretched them to their limit, and he determined to give his whole life to serve them. He brought these two loves together into a union whose rich complexity sometimes attains an almost ethereal simplicity. The world is charged with the grandeur of God, he writes. Paul was like this, and for a similar reason. He clearly loved words. He relished their flavor and nuance. You can feel him doing it. He knew how to write grand flowing sentences and also short, sharp, arresting ones. His poetry, in a few words, some of the greatest truths ever. He clearly loved Jesus too, and he pulled and stretched his words so they turn into memorable phrases and passages where the vivid complexity has resolved into pastoral simplicity. Think of the great poem to love in 1 Corinthians 13. Now there remain faith, hope, and love, but the greatest of these is love. Paul's philosophical ethics are as profound as Aristotle. In fact, I cut my intellectual teeth on Plato and Aristotle, and then when I moved on to St. Paul, I realized here is somebody who ranks with them, if not above, intellectually. But for Paul, the abstract principle of virtue is replaced by the living presence of Jesus. One of my personal heroes, albeit with feet of clay, is Albert Schweitzer. He's more complex. He wrote dissertations on Immanuel Kant and on Jesus. He was a world-class organist, an expert. He wrote 2 massive volumes on Johann Sebastian Bach. He had a lifelong fascination with Goethe. And he would stand in the middle, he thought, between Bach and Wagner, explaining what music was all about. And he would stand in the middle between Jesus and Friedrich Nietzsche, one of Schweitzer's own heroes, seeing what they had in common and how they could be rearticulated for today. And for him, this emerged in his famous principle of reverence for life, rooted, he saw, more or less in the Gospels, and then to medical missionary work in West Africa. He was flawed, probably genius. So the parallel with Paul here is more complex, but Paul too stood where different speech and into the complexities of a life constantly on the move. The collision of those world accomplishment of Jesus and in the new energy which Paul said was God's Spirit at work. Paul belonged very much within his own native Jewish world, but he was also at home in the world of Greek thought and philosophy. He'd grown up in Tarsus, which was one of the major philosophical centers in the Greek world. But he also worked and traveled within the world of imperial Rome. The Jew, the Greek, the Roman. Paul stands where those worlds collide. And many people today, if asked who was Paul, would probably just give you sense. You need all three and quite possibly more if you're going to get the full picture and recognize the extraordinary genius. Now, of course, if you isolate just one or two themes from Paul's writings and then turn them into street plays, this glory will never emerge. It will, to look back to that unfortunate popular image again, it will look as though he really was a fussy little nuisance of a man, banging on about pet topics in complex language. And part of the answer to that might be that if the only music you like is Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, then please don't listen to Wagner. Western culture has often wanted. Sorry?
Tom, this is Anthony. Can I just intervene just for a second to say that we are having some technical issues tonight. I think it might. Could you try turning off your lens so that we'll lose the vision on you? But there's a good chance that might mean that we can hear you. We have over 4,000 people listening tonight to you.
I've turned off the camera.
So if you turn off your own camera let's proceed. And we're just going to have a quick word with the technician, Matt, to see if you've got any other ideas, Matt, for what might improve it.
I'll have a look in the background.
Okay. So Tom, if you carry on, and we can certainly hear you, and we'll see if that makes no difference, Matt. Can you let Tom know, and we'll put the camera back on?
Okay. I think I have turned the camera off. Matt, does that look as if I have?
Yes.
Okay.
Good luck.
Right. Sorry about this. Who knows where the technology is letting us down?
It's absolutely marvelous.
Shall I just carry on?
Absolutely. On you go, Tom.
Okay, right. Okay, so to go back, a part of the answer to the suggestion that Paul was a nuisance of a little man banging on about this and that is that if the only music you like is Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, then please don't listen to Wagner or indeed to Mozart himself. But unfortunately, Western culture has often wanted the nursery rhyme version, a sort of Christianity light. But Paul refuses to play that game. And that's because he glimpsed an inner dynamic within Israel's scriptures, a sparkling set of promises which, like a firework, had been waiting to explode until the rocket had reached full height. And Paul believed that this had happened with Jesus. And that's the very center of his thought. Who was Paul? He was a man obsessed with the fact that the God in whom he believed had acted dramatically and climactically in Jesus. So Paul isn't about a system or a philosophy or a general truth about God or a type of religion or an admission ticket to heaven. Paul is about something that happened, something that has changed the world, and something that can and does and will change human beings and societies. He wrote in one of his letters, all God's promises find their yes in Jesus as Israel's Messiah and therefore as the world's true Lord. People sometimes suggest that Paul was the real founder of Christianity, but that is simply a category mistake. For Paul, Jesus was the center of everything. Jesus had written the music, and it was Paul's job to teach the world to sing it. Or in Paul's own language, Jesus had defeated the dark powers that had enslaved the world. And now what had to happen was that Paul and others like him had to go out into the world and tell people that they had nothing to lose but their chains, and then to coordinate the little cells of Jesus followers so that they demonstrated what that would mean. Now, this is the vantage point from which Paul's astonishing multicultural project can best be seen. It wasn't mere pragmatism, exploiting his Roman citizenship and his knowledge of Greek culture to spread a strange new oddball message. It was what in the trade we might call deep-rooted Jewish eschatology. And what does that mean? Eschatology is about hope. It's about where things are going, about God's ultimate future for the world. As a Jew, Paul had believed that Israel's God, the Creator, was the true Lord of all the world. But it certainly didn't look like that in his day, and perhaps it never had since the days of David and Solomon. So, like devout Jews for half a millennium, Paul had lived with the concrete and social and political version of our modern problem of evil. Let me spell that out just a bit. In our comfortable modern Western world, okay, it's not that comfortable right now, but you know what I mean. When people talk about the problem of evil, they usually mean either the abstract one, if God is in charge, why are there earthquakes and pandemics? Or the personal one, if God loves me, why did he let me get cancer? For the Jewish people in the half millennium before Jesus, as for millions in our world today, the problem is cosmic and political. If our God is who we think he is, why are wicked people running the world? Why are they wrecking our lives? Why are they forcing our children into slavery? For the Jews of Paul's day, this was all the more acute in that the pagan powers who had ruled over them for centuries were just that, pagan. They were idol worshippers, whereas Israel believed in the one God, and idols are seriously bad for your health. So the Jewish problem of evil was sharply focused. If our God is the true God, why doesn't he sort out the mess and rescue us? And if the answer is, well, he's biding his time and will one day show the world who's really in charge, the next question will be, all right, but when and how is he going to do this? We only appreciate who Paul was and his genius when we grasp that everything he said about Jesus was part of his answer to that question. And with that answer, the cosmic and the political and the personal are held tightly together, a stroke of genius. Very few of Paul's interpreters down the years have even tried to think through how all that works together. So Paul was not, to say it again, because this is what most people assume, Paul was not simply telling people, quote, how to get to heaven, unquote. He was not, certainly, propounding the low-grade theory you sometimes hear, which masquerades as his theology of justification by faith, the watered-down theory according to which you get to heaven not by obeying a moral law, but by believing a few doctrines. No. Paul was announcing that with Jesus, God's new creation had begun. He was summoning people of all sorts to become not just beneficiaries, but active agents within this extraordinary project. The ultimate future was indeed assured, not just beyond death, but also beyond the shadowy realm of the grave, because Paul insisted, as he'd believed as a Pharisee, and now all the more because of what had happened to Jesus, that God would at the end raise all his people to new bodily life in a transformed creation. But for Paul, the thrust of the gospel was that with Jesus, God's future had come into the present with a new sort of power and a new sort of glory. It wasn't what people had expected. It wasn't what Paul himself had expected. But once he had thought through the transforming shock of the Damascus Road, he knew that this was what Israel's scriptures had promised all along: a new world, a new and shocking Messiah, a new worldwide people. Now, folk often suggest that at this point Paul must have been, therefore, as they say, quote, starting a new religion, unquote. And here we run into a big problem of language. The word religion meant something utterly different in Paul's day to what it means in our day. And the communities which sprang up when Paul announced the good news didn't look like either of them, either religion of Paul's time or religion of our time. Face it, in our world today, religion is normally about private spirituality, and its corporate expression in church is detached from social and political life, even when, as in England and Scotland, there is something called an established church. But when Paul said Jesus is Lord, part of his meaning was that Caesar wasn't. By contrast, the word religion in our own day has come to reflect the split world of the Western Enlightenment, with humans gesturing towards a distant and scarcely knowable divinity, the cold world of deism at best. But Paul's God was alive, making plans, carrying them out. And as in Paul's Bible, this God regularly acted in and through human agents. And those human agents were then called to live across the grain of the present world. They found it tough, sometimes unbearably so, but also exhilarating and joyful. Who wasn't Paul? He was somebody who knew all of that in his personal experience. So in Paul's own world, religion meant almost the opposite of its meaning today. Religion in Paul's day was about public life, keeping the local gods on side, with the local gods now including Caesar and Rome. And this religion was all about temples and priests and animal sacrifices and going to oracles to seek advice and looking for auguries to see if it was a good day for a business deal or a wedding or whatever. There is no equivalent of any of that in Paul's communities. So the idea of anyone in the first century inventing a religion, either of the ancient sort or the modern sort, misses the point entirely. That's not who Paul was. No, Paul believed that Jesus of Nazareth was Israel's Messiah and as such the rightful Lord of the whole world, embodying the personal return of the Creator God. Paul then didn't have to stop thinking Jewishly in order to articulate his message to the non-Jewish world. People have often imagined that, but that's wrong. Paul had to be deeply rooted in precisely that Jewish heritage. And the communities that sprang up following his Jesus announcement were, in his view, a new sort of Jewish community, now extraordinarily incorporating non-Jews who believed in Jesus. And that, in fact, was what justification by faith was originally about. So this brings us back to the place where we see Paul's genius at work. He stands at the confluence of those three great cultures, the Jewish, the Greek, and the Roman. He is rooted in the Jewish world, claiming that his message about Jesus is the real God-given fulfillment of the long and high Jewish hope. But he thinks and writes within the world of the Greek philosophers, not simply to borrow a few ideas, nor simply to engage where possible, though he does that, but in the conviction that all truth is God's truth and must therefore be captured and brought on side. Every valid insight within the world's philosophies, Paul believed, must be located within the larger truth of the divine wisdom that has become human in Jesus. And Paul plans and strategizes in the Roman world, and there as a citizen he can confront local magistrates and demand proper legal treatment, not because he's compromising his loyalty to Jesus, but because the very scriptures which prophesied about the Messiah made it clear that the rulers of the nations must be called to submit to this coming king. So Paul thus employs his triple location, not in an ad hoc or merely pragmatic bricolage of ideas culled from a variety of sources, but out of the core conviction that Israel's God, now embodied in Jesus and savingly active through his Spirit, is the creator and restorer of all. But that, of course, is just the start. Like Schweitzer reconciling the musicians and the moralists and then going off to run a hospital in West Africa, Paul is anything but a stay-at-home theoretician. And that's partly, of course, because having thought through the glorious and scripturally dense fabric of gospel truth, he longs to communicate it. But it's only partly that. It is more because his scripturally rooted vision is of the whole world under the rescuing lordship of Jesus. And within that, his particular vocation is to bring that vision into practical reality. He has been instructed to launch the movement through which the earlier events concerning Jesus would become effective in the launching and maintenance of communities loyal to Jesus right under the nose of Caesar. So Paul's missionary strategy is far more than merely pragmatic. If the Jews won't listen, maybe the Gentiles will. Nor is it a matter simply of snatching a few souls from ruin to prepare them for a distant and detached heaven. That's the view of the Middle Platonists, not of Paul. No, if Jesus is the world's true Lord, Paul believed, his rule must become a reality on earth as in heaven. So when Paul announces the message of the crucified and risen Lord, the Spirit works in people's hearts and minds to turn them into loyal subjects of this surprising new king. And that turning happens both outwardly, away from idols to serve the living God, and inwardly with a strange, powerful, and deeply demanding transformation of life and character. That is where faith or belief comes in. The word Paul uses for faith also means loyalty or trustworthiness. The core Christian conviction is that the crucified Jesus was raised from the dead, and that event signaled that his death had been a victory, overcoming the deadly power of the idols. Jesus was now the rightful Lord, though his rule would be radically different from any rule you'd expect in normal life. So for Paul, faith is a quite specific, not a generalized or vague religious awareness. It was the belief that Jesus was Lord and that God raised him from the dead. And where people believed like that, Paul saw the new royal family, the Messiah's people. Such people were to be seen as the true children of Abraham, since God had promised Abraham a family of many nations. Several things resulted at once. This was where Paul got into trouble, because the most immediate political spin-off was that the new Jesus believers would have to renounce the worship of idols, including Caesar and his family. Ancient religion had divinities on every street corner and in every living room, but that Paul believed was a snare and a delusion. But if you gave it up to worship the God revealed in Jesus, that would be widely perceived as antisocial. The gods would be angry. The community would be at risk. So Paul's message got Paul and his converts into trouble. And again, his genius shines through in how he faced that and interpreted it. Suffering wasn't just an accidental byproduct of his message. Paul dug deep into his own scriptural tradition, and he found there, among other things, the Psalms of Lament. It was part of Israel's vocation, so it seemed, to suffer unjustly, and for that suffering to be part of the strange means by which the Creator God would make a way through the world's sorrow to the new world that was even now struggling to be born, causing the old world to go into labor pains. Jesus had taken the full weight of that on himself, but his followers too, Paul found, would find themselves, as he says, groaning in travail, in labor pains. And when that happened, They were to understand that this was God's own Spirit groaning within them as well. Paul stitched all this into the rich tapestry of his writings, all the more vivid because we can hear the preacher and teacher coming through on the page. No wonder people sometimes sat up all night to listen to him. At the heart of it all, we find Paul's extraordinary vision of what we subsequently call the church. And this is another reason why he got into trouble. Of course, the very word church makes many of our contemporaries shudder, but that's because today's church has often failed to embody the kind of community Paul had in mind. The community Paul had in mind, it's extraordinary. It was a multi-ethnic, polychrome, egalitarian, mutually supportive, worship-based, spiritually renewed, culturally creative, socially responsible, fictive kinship group. It was gender blind in its leadership. It was outward facing in its generosity. They were to be known as good citizens while giving ultimate allegiance to Jesus rather than Caesar. Paul's genius, I think, is visible right here. He not only saw this community in his mind's eye, he understood how to bring it about and maintain it. It would take prayer and humility, discerning the moment both for forthright speech and for the gentle touch. And Paul worked tirelessly and often tearfully to this end. Who was Paul? He was a hard-working church planter and maintainer for all the reasons I've given. And the immediate trouble Paul then faced was that by its very nature, this community was composed of all nations, all ethnicities, but he was claiming that it was the fulfillment of God's ancient promises to Israel. This was politically dangerous in another way. The Romans had allowed the Jews to worship simply their own God. They had freedom to do that. They didn't have to worship the pagan gods, but now Paul was creating new polychrome, polyglot, polyethnic communities claiming the same privilege. And this was dynamite, both for the local non-Jewish community leaders and especially for local Jewish communities themselves in places like Turkey and Greece, which were the main centers of Paul's work. But Paul's vision of those Jesus-believing communities was compelling. For him, the community was to be two things in particular. First, it was to be the new temple, where God himself would come to dwell by his Spirit. The temple for a zealous Jew is the place where heaven and earth meet, an advance sign of what God intends to do for the whole creation in the end. And Paul saw the church, this motley crew of surprised and still muddled believers, as exactly that, a sign to the world of heaven coming to earth. And second, it was therefore to be the sign to the world in its very existence that Jesus was its rightful Lord and Caesar wasn't. This unheard of, extraordinary community, living prayerful, suffering, joyful, holy lives, exhibiting strong unity, but with rich diversity. Nobody had ever imagined, let alone seen, that kind of thing before. Genesis had taught that humans were made to be God reflectors, image bearers, demonstrating to the rest of creation who the true God really is. And Paul says again and again, that's what we are supposed to be doing. This is the real cutting edge of Paul's vision of justification, that all those who believe in Jesus belong in the same family, no matter what their cultural, ethnic or moral or social background. Family, yes. Families eat together, they worship together, they suffer together, they celebrate together, they argue and they try to have things out together. The Jesus believers formed a single family that did all that, or as Paul said, was supposed to. Their faith may have been the only thing they had in common, but that was enough. Oh, Paul's genius, theological and spiritual and literary and organizational, thus comes up against a brick wall in the modern Western world, because today's church has all but forgotten this extraordinary vision. When we've asked the question, who was Paul, we've said, oh, he was this man teaching us what to believe to get to heaven. No, that's wrong. We have taken the bits of the teaching we want that serve our hopes, and we've left the rest to gather dust. We have colluded with ecclesial division. with the separation of Jesus followers into gatherings of the like-minded, the same-coloured, or the socially compatible. And as our world once again explodes with the anger of those who have suffered centuries of oppression, we see all too clearly that the church has often been part of the problem. But Paul was nevertheless struggling to maintain a Jesus-focused multicultural community. Paul found that challenging, to say the least, as you might expect, because we today, in the post-Enlightenment world, we've been trying to get the results of that message of Jesus without the Jewish and Christian roots. As Pope Benedict said prophetically 10 or a dozen years ago, if you try to achieve human rights or egalitarian freedoms as independent social features without their Jewish and Christian roots, you won't get the fruit of the tree. Paul's vision was for a world put right, with humans being put right as the sign and focus of that ultimate goal. We too struggle with justice. We have a lot to learn from St. Paul. We also struggle with questions of spirituality. People have started to realize that the flatland world of atheist materialism just doesn't really cut it. Paul can come to our help with a fresh vision of spirituality to take us forward. And then Paul believed, of course, in freedom, as we all do in theory. Paul, in classic Jewish style, told and retold the story of the Exodus from Egypt, the God who reveals himself supremely in the freeing of the slaves. Paul knew, as all the early Christians knew, that Jesus had chosen Passover, the Exodus festival, as the key moment to do what he had to do. And we can see that working out at every level of Paul's teaching. For him, the Jesus people are the new Exodus people, and they must display this in every aspect of their individual and communal life. Paul's vision of human freedom then never collapses into anarchy, though some of his followers did try to take it in that direction, but rather into the strong, vivid freedom to become genuinely human, reflecting God's image into the world in a way previously unimaginable. These and other great themes remain the staple diet of our urgent discourse today. And if we ignore the question of who was Paul, we cut off possibilities of real insight and hope. The irony then is that by belittling the genius of Paul, by forgetting his towering vision of the church as the sign to the world of the loving purposes of the Creator God, and by focusing attention simply on isolated bits and pieces of his writings, the church has itself often poured concrete over the root which ought to be producing new branches and fresh fruit. The church, the followers of Jesus in whatever configuration, should have been all along the sign to the world of a different way to be human. My friends, it is time to break open the concrete and let the tree grow. It's time to pay attention once more to the larger world restorative vision which Paul the Apostle expounded with such vigor. The world urgently needs the music, the poetry, the vision for life, which the genius of Paul can still offer. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Tom, very much indeed for that. And it was a wonderful talk. And thank you very much to the viewers, now listeners, for sticking with us. Matt, the technician, says that we have kept up with over 4,000 people, Tom. So even though they couldn't see you, we, according to Matt, the numbers have kept very high. Now,
Good.
I'm going to be, which is wonderful, and my sincere apologies to everybody for the technical difficulties. First of all, with me not appearing physically and visually, and then Tom's microphone. But in fact, Tom, just to reassure you, from the moment that you turned your camera off, we could hear every word.
Good. Thank you.
Crystal clear. So the first question is if you met St. Paul, what question would you most want to ask him?
Oh my! I've often thought.
That's from me, by the way.
Right.
I throw you that just while I sort the questions out.
Okay. I mean, the first thing I suspect would be some of the really, really odd, tricky passages which still obtain in his thought. For instance, in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, where he has a very interesting argument about men and women wearing headgear or not in worship. I, like many scholars, have struggled with that paragraph. Some people have suggested that he was quoting the Corinthians in order to refute them, and I would like to know whether that was in fact the case, or if not, what exactly he was on about, because that bit sticks out to me like a sore thumb from so much else that's going on. That's the thing that comes straight off the top of my head. May seem a bit arcane, but that's the one that jumps out at me.
That'll do very well, and thank you for answering it, Tom. And then a question. I don't know how the question says St. Paul died. How important was the manner of his death to the historical and religious St. Paul?
Yes, I think Paul recognized that unless he died in a shipwreck or something beforehand, it was highly likely that he would meet a violent end. He had mobs set on him, he was stoned once, but it is highly probable, in fact, that he was executed on the orders of Nero in Rome, whether in the early 60s after the arrival at the time of Acts 28, or a bit later if he'd managed to do some other journeys which Acts doesn't record, because I think Acts just brings us to the point when Paul arrives in Rome and has his first hearing after 2 years. But I think for Paul that wouldn't really matter, because he says at various points, for instance in Philippians chapter 1, that he is ready for that, and that if that's what has to happen to him, then he says, for me to live means the Messiah, and to die is gain, because I will depart and be with the Messiah, which is far better. His allegiance to Jesus, in other words, is the thing, and if he dies this way or that, then that's not going to worry him. And it's interesting that though, of course, we have significant legends from the second and subsequent centuries about Paul being beheaded, as would happen to a Roman citizen, that is later legend rather than definite history.
Next question. You mentioned the Dead Sea Scrolls, and thank you for a wonderful talk, the question says. Is it possible that there might be still to be undiscovered texts that would reveal even more about Paul, and how certain are we of the historical Paul and his journeys and letters?
I think we are very sure in analysing historically that Paul. I wrote a biography of Paul 2 or 3 years ago, as some of you will know, and I think we can be pretty safe in figuring out the toing and froing of his journeys and roughly which order he wrote the letters. There's some bits which are tricky in the middle of that, but that's common to all ancient history. For the Dead Sea Scrolls and similar things, yes, 70 or 80 years ago, nobody knew about the Dead Sea Scrolls, and then suddenly a shepherd boy throws a stone into a cave and whoosh, there's an entire scholarly growth industry, which is wonderful. And that can happen again and again. And it's one of the things I would love personally to see, would be somebody to dig up some more documents in Egypt or Syria or Palestine or wherever, which would shed more light, because as an ancient historian, I want every coin, every fragment, every piece of manuscript, because it all really helps. Ancient history of any sort is like a vast jigsaw with 3/4, if not more, of the pieces missing. And that's how it is. But we've got enough. We've got enough to be pretty certain, not only about Jesus, but certainly about St. Paul. If you try to imagine how the first century would have worked in terms of the origin of Christianity without St. Paul doing what he did, it simply can't be done. You'd have to invent someone else really rather like him to fill the gap that would be left.
What would the Damascus Road experience have actually been like? How much do we know about it?
It's a wonderful and mysterious thing. I, like some other scholars, have cautiously suggested that what Paul was doing, as he was probably riding on a donkey on the way to Damascus, was meditating. If you were on a long journey and the beast under you was just steadily trudging forward, you had time to pray and contemplate. And devout Jews of the type that Paul was often meditated on the throne vision at the beginning of the book of Ezekiel, in the hope and the prayer that they might, with the eyes of the heart, be able to rise up from the throne chariot and actually see the figure who is sitting on the throne, who is God himself. And one of the best explanations for what happened on the road to Damascus, and I've explored this in my biography and elsewhere, is that Paul was doing this, and when finally he got to see the figure on the throne, he discovered it was Jesus, which was simultaneously the fulfillment of all his hopes and the destruction of all his hopes, which means a sort of a cataclysmic psychological moment where he is blinded and led by the hand and so on. Quite how you describe such an event, whether in the 20th century or the 21st century or the first century, is of course open to all sorts of theories, and people have had wild, fantastic ideas about maybe he had an epileptic seizure and so on. I've studied most of those theories, and they might be so, but almost certainly not. Much more likely that Paul was doing what many devout Jews did in prayer, and that in that prayer to the God of Israel, he had this fresh moment of revelation with his physical eyes, with his eyes of his heart. How do we differentiate? Anyone who's had that kind of overwhelming experience will know that we're pretty close to the borders of language here, if not going beyond. And we just have to say something extraordinary happened.
Was St. Paul what we would now describe as a mystic? Was he an outsider? Did people question his sanity at the time?
Oh, yes, people questioned his sanity. Indeed, there's a famous occasion in the book of Acts when the Roman governor, as Paul is talking his talk, the Roman governor yells out, "Paul, you're mad, your years of study have driven you crazy." And Paul says, "No, actually, I'm quite sane, thank you very much." But naturally, people would think that because he didn't fit their categories. He could outthink them. He was miles ahead of them in the argument and the scriptural relevance and so on. As to whether he's a mystic, it depends what you mean, of course. The word mystic has had many different meanings. Albert Schweitzer's famous book, The Mysticism of Paul the Apostle, expounds mysticism in terms of Paul's language about being in Christ, or Christ being in me or in us. And if that's what you mean by mysticism, then yes, that is central to Paul. But often people have taken the idea of mysticism and meant it almost in an anti-intellectual way, as though you don't need to think too hard about this, you just go into a different space, as it were. And the one thing we know about Paul was that he could think pretty sharply and pretty fast and hard and produce arguments that would knock the socks off most people in the room, while at the same time being personally, spiritually, very much a man of prayer. And we can feel the prayerfulness coming through. And the prayers are not just sort of empty prayers shouting into a void. They are good Jewish style wrestlings with the God who has made promises and who we have to hold to keep those promises.
Could you say something more about Christ's understanding of Paul's understanding of Christ? How did he gain his understanding of the life and mission of Jesus?
Yeah, that's fascinating, because of course Paul doesn't refer to very many events in the life of Jesus other than his death and resurrection, although there are echoes at various points in the letter of other bits and pieces which we know from the gospel tradition. What we do know is that Paul believed passionately, like so many Jews at the time, that it was time for Israel's God to come back in person. The prophecies are full of that. Isaiah, Malachi, Zechariah, they're saying that God says he's going to come back in person and rescue his people. But there was no set interpretation of what that might look like when he did. And then when this extraordinary human being shows up and does what he does, says what he says, Paul and the others quickly came to believe that somehow, in a way that burst their categories, of course, Israel's God had done what he said he would in the person of Jesus. And they seized on this little phrase, Son of God, which was used by Jesus himself, or referring to God as Father, as a way of holding together that belief with the belief in the God who was the creator, etc. We can see that going on in Paul's prayers, like in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, if anyone wants to look it up. But simultaneously, Paul had been waiting for Israel's Messiah. And here's the trick, that in Psalm 2 and 2 Samuel 7 and one or two other passages, the Messiah is referred to as the Son of God. So it looks as though the phrase Son of God was able to face both ways as a way of holding on to this idea of Jesus as the human embodiment of the one true God, and holding on to Jesus as Israel's Messiah, and seeing those two categories as astonishingly made for one another. I think that's about as sharp as I can say it, but it would take 2 or 3 books, I would think, to expound that in detail.
Well, we look forward to those coming up.
Well, thank you.
Michael says, what do you think Paul would make of the modern world today if he was alive to see it?
I think Paul would see 2 quite different things. I think he would see, and I'm thinking here of Tom Holland's recent book, Dominion, I think Paul would see that the modern world as we know it has been massively influenced by the gospel. So many things which we take for granted, including supposedly secular ideals like human rights, they have visibly and demonstrably come into our world through the long story of the Judeo-Christian world as it's developed in various ways. Of course, that doesn't mean that we've got it all right, just that there is a huge culture change. And as an ancient historian, as I look at Paul's world and the attitudes to slavery or whatever it might be, then there's all kinds of things which have changed. At the same time, I think you would see that paganism keeps on making a comeback, and particularly in terms of human tyranny and human abuse of other humans and so on. But I think the thing that would sadden Paul most of all, and you'll see why I say this from my talk, is that the church today is not only disunited, but doesn't seem to care about being disunited. And Paul would say, how can you possibly be demonstrating to the world who the one God really is if you're not doing it together? That would be like, come on, guys, wake up and smell the coffee.
Do you mean divisions within Anglicanism, between Anglicans and Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox?
Yes, I mean, we've made great strides in the last 100 years in relationships between Anglicans, Catholics, Orthodox, Anglicans and Methodists, Anglicans and Pentecostals, etc. And I've found as a biblical scholar that I can cross those boundaries quite easily, and I get asked to lecture here and there for different churches because the Bible somehow is still a focus of unity often, though it can still also be an apparent cause of division. It's more that, I mean, for instance, I go to America a lot, not this year because of COVID, but I have been going, and so many new churches get planted very enthusiastically, and they do amazing things, and lots of people come to faith, but there seems to be no imperative to say we must link up with the other people down the street who are also worshipping the God revealed in Jesus. It's as though this is free enterprise country and we don't need to worry about saying the same thing. And I fear that one of the reasons that the world has taken some of the turns it has in recent years is because the church has not been speaking with one voice. Not only the great ancient traditions like Rome and the Orthodox and Anglicanism, but the many, many modern versions which have sprung up in the last 200 or 300 years.
Well, you've answered there Vicky's question, which is, do you think that so many of the problems in the world today are because people have just taken snippets and interpret them, those snippets, rather than looking at the whole gospel and what Paul was saying? Just a final thought, Tom. We've out of time.
Hello. Yeah.
Just a final
Yes.
thought on just summing it all up. I'm going to pin you down here. I'm going to ask you most unfairly, is there a what would you, it's like asking what your favorite Mozart is, but even more extreme. When to you is Paul at his most sublime? What verses in particular?
I think I would have to say that amazing passage at the end of Romans chapter 8, Romans 8 verses 31 to 39. What shall we say then? If God is for us, who can be against us? And there is a great deal of suffering in that passage. For your sake, we are being killed all the day long. We're being counted as sheep for the slaughter. And yet we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. And it's all about the victory of God's love. And that's what drove Paul. He says in Galatians, the Son of God loved me and gave himself for me. And that's what comes through again and again. And sadly, not everyone realizes that when they read St. Paul, but that last coda at the end of Romans 8, verses 31 to 39, would say it all.
We'll leave that as your final thought in a truly glorious talk, which managed to rise above technical difficulties assaulting us on this Sunday evening, and your voice and your message, Tom, are loud and clear. So thank you very much to
thank you
for giving us an hour of your time and for so powerfully putting across who the real St. Paul was. And thank you also to all the 4,000 plus of you listening. Thank you for your patience and understanding about tonight. Do stay with these series organised by the University of Buckingham. We have another 15 talks coming up tomorrow night, very different topic. David Thompson, the great cinema writer, perhaps the greatest cinema writer alive, talking about the 10 top directors. So a different topic. Tom, thank you very, very much indeed. We're greatly in your debt.
Thank you very much. It's been good to be with you.